Right now I'm walking along a footpath here in southern England. I'm not trespassing, I'm not doing anything illegal, but
I am next to a significant fence line, a border between peace and calm, and a world of secrecy here to my immediate south.
in fact, if I turn the camera around now 180 degrees and show you the sign that I'm looking at, in no uncertain terms I would be prosecuted.
This isn't a nuclear base, an airport, or any kind of intelligence headquarters.
This is Porton Down.
Releases over public areas.
And the cloud passing over the Ark.
The public were used as guinea pigs for these experiments.
Throughout the last century, this place has become shrouded in secrecy, the UK's Chemical and Biological Defence Research Centre. By its own admission in the 1950s, chemical and biological agents were released into the open air. A trawler boat off the coast of Scotland was inadvertently exposed during a trial involving plague bacteria. The people then allowed to simply mingle amongst others. And here in southern England, simulant substances including zinc, cadmium sulphide were released over populated areas.
Now, all this before we even mention tests done on young servicemen exposed to nerve agents. People weren't told about this for decades. No one outside of this system knew, and even at the time it was very much kept within official circles. And here we are now in 2026 looking over that embankment there at a site that's 28 square kilometres built on fear and secrecy.
A place that after the Cold War began to consider questions of its own ethics and accountability. Perhaps never just a secret military lab, but it became a mirror for how far society is willing to go when it believes the threats are existential.
This is the story of why Britain built its own Area 51, a site that still today feels the need to deny existence of aliens within its boundaries, and of course why its secrets never remained buried. 16th of September 1952, and a trawler heading back from a fishing trip in the Icelandic waters, heading to its hometown of Blackpool, north-western England.
It would take a route south between mainland Scotland and the Isle of Lewis. Notably, the plan was to travel here, heading south past this bay between Tolster Head and Cellar Head. For the last week prior to that trip, the wind here in this bay had been blowing the wrong way. That was at least for a team of Porton Down scientists that were stationed here on a pontoon, undertaking some airborne tests involving over 3,000 guinea pigs and 80 monkeys.
The wind had been blowing west, but today we now have for the first time in a while a wind blowing in the right direction, northeast up into the open seas.
The conditions for these tests were now perfect. A converted tank landing craft had been set up to hold these animals, and now pneumonic and bubonic plague germs would be released over these animals. But there was an issue.
And with just 1 minute to go before these plague germs were released into the cloud over the pontoon, well, the trawler came into view heading back from Iceland. Now the captain of this project, the captain of this pontoon, he decided, well, a minute was plenty of time to warn the trawler and its captain to perhaps take a different route.
Now at this point, either the captain of the trawler did not see or hear the warning from the Porton Down crew, or decided to ignore them because they simply carried on their journey on the same heading. Within 16 minutes and about 2 miles of their original position, the trawler passed through this germ cloud. The captain of the Porton Down crew initially suggested the wind speed was only 6 miles an hour, which meant it was going nowhere near fast enough to carry the germ cloud towards the trawler.
However, in his second report soon after, well, this had been restated. Now it's stated 9 miles per hour.
All of a sudden, this now became a political matter. The First Sea Lord and the Chancellor of the Exchequer were now involved.
It was considered absolute high priority not to tell the trawler and its crew and even the nation what had just happened.
The scientists on board the pontoon were warning that the rats of the trawler, if there were any, should be killed and the ship fumigated. Meanwhile, the trawler carried on its journey to Blackpool.
But it gets worse. You see, the 18 crew, well, they were then followed from the horizon and the distance. Their broadcasts were listened to presumably make sure nobody fell ill, and then they were just allowed to disembark at Blackpool and mix amongst their perhaps friends and family. Now miraculously no one did show any symptoms, and the crew themselves, well, they wouldn't find out what had just happened to them for another 50 years.
It's important to note that in 2008 the MOD made it very clear that the practices at this time do not reflect modern standards and instead should be understood as a historical record of Cold War research.
Now, for a long time I've had a fascination with this line, this border, and what lies beyond it. Not the sort of the secrecy, but perhaps the quirks of the landscape that I love on this channel. In fact, right here now, just running perpendicular to this line, is another line that goes way into the landscape of Porton Down, and it's a border, the Hampshire-Wiltshire border, and it's called Smuggler's Lane. And of course we can only follow it so far, we can't obviously go into Porton Down, but it's said that smugglers would run up and down this carrying their wares, and they were able to just skip from county to county depending on which sheriff was going to prosecute them or whatever. So if you were on the Hampshire side, or you just zip across the other side of the border into the boundaries of Wiltshire. I'm not sure how true that is, but that line, which is right here, and there should be some boundary stones in the hedge there, well, that heads straight on into Porton Down.
And to the south of here, on the southern borders of Porton Down, we see half a dozen footpaths going straight into the Porton Down landscape and then simply stopping halfway through. In fact, even if we flip to the definitive maps, the absolute certain maps beyond the OS maps, well, by then definition we would be able to walk along these footpaths. However, at the start of each of these pathways we have clear instruction from the MOD that you will be prosecuted if you cross this line and this border, so I certainly would advise against it.
How exactly does this happen? How does this vast swathe of landscape all of a sudden become this government restricted zone, this highest security which we can't even film?
World War I taught us that the enemies of Britain were prepared to use chemical and biological weapons, and at a midpoint within that war the necessity for a facility such as this suddenly became apparent.
Well, we already have from this very point that way for about 30 miles Salisbury Plain, and from the 1900s an increasingly militarised zone as they continue to buy up large chunks of land to serve that purpose, the war effort.
By 1917 we were starting to build our own chemical arsenal, but a year later the war would end, and here we are 100 years on more, and with what appears to be a very active site.
Now, despite signing the Geneva Protocol in 1925, restricting the use of chemical weapons to retaliation only, well, Britain's stance, the government's stance, seems to be getting more and more aggressive, and with World War II on the horizon we now seem to be stockpiling chemical agents. Now, remember I told you about that the border, the crossing point that heads on into Porton Down. Well, if I keep the camera this way, we have right here a small break in the line of this footpath, this bridleway, and we have an old railway bridge or an overbridge over the top of it, and there's our railway there in the distance, and of course off to the left, which I'm not going to put on camera, is Porton Down, and here we have many signs every 10 yards saying do not film, do not take any photographs, do not cross this border. Fascinating stuff. Operation Cauldron taught us what secrecy looks like here, but from a significant distance, way out into north-eastern Scotland, the open seas, pontoons, animals, but these tests would soon, very soon, demand more realism.
World War II saw Porton Down approve human trials, and in 1953 we see the sad loss of an aircraftsman, Ronald Madison, after researchers applied a small amount of sarin drops to his forearm through 2 layers of cloth during a trial. The test continued, and it's believed that the people involved were well aware they were taking part in these tests, and the tests themselves were considered safe at the time. Protective equipment was worn, minor chemical exposure was used, all seen as mitigating factors whilst trying to understand how they actually affected humans.
What they were not always told is the nature of the substances and of course the potential risks associated with them. All of this was now an assumption, a Cold War assumption of how we need to deal with risk and necessity.
And would spray that from the aeroplane as it flew low across part of the UK.
The next truly bizarre, because I can't think of another word to describe what was about to happen, the madness of what we now perceive to look back on to be completely madness, well, was about to take place, and this time it would take place from the skies.
The Cold War gave us an assumption that if an attack did happen, it wouldn't be offshore, it would instead happen over our own cities, and the scientists here needed to know how far particles would travel, different weather conditions and how they dispersed.
And with that, we now move and expand our area just away from Portendown, or the seas of northern Scotland, into the entirety of southern England. The secrecy aspect is about to again ramp up, because in many cases here the local authorities didn't even know what was happening, and here we are now in the 1950s about to undertake a series of aerial dispersal experiments.
You can't smell it, you can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't feel it.
With absolutely no consent from anyone who would be affected by these experiments, it's important to highlight that this was not a weapon but instead a tracer, which would be used to understand how a potential chemical or biological attack and the agents themselves would spread and disperse through the air.
However, and this is a big however, this would involve the release of a substance called zinc cadmium sulfide.
Wiltshire, Hampshire, Berkshire, Dorset, Somerset and Surrey were the main areas for these trials conducted by Portendown. These releases were not presented as human experiments, they were framed as environmental studies, focusing on airflow and movement and dispersion.
Now, the fluorescent nature of this tracer would highlight this metaphorically and physically, and the MOD would go on to suggest and concede that this chemical spray could have potentially caused harm. Now, it's important to highlight this substance was considered safe at the time. We now know it's a toxic metal which can accumulate in the kidney, the livers and the bones.
An inquiry later would conclude that the trials were not illegal. The decisions were judged against contemporary scientific understanding. There was no clear evidence that the aerial spraying caused widespread harm. The trials seem to very much reflect Cold War assumptions about national defence.
Now, for decades, everything that we have just talked about, everything we've just seen, that remained classified. And then come the 1990s, well, the Cold War threat is pretty much over. And now, of course, Portendown has a whole new set of problems to deal with.
Questions from veterans, from families, from journalists and from Parliament. What had been done and exactly in whose name? So slowly, through a combination of declassification, legal challenges and inquests, well, Portendown began to emerge. And here is the important thing, it didn't reveal any kind of scandal.
Well, these documents would confirm that servicemen were exposed back in the 1950s to dangerous substances. They'd confirm that aerial tests did take place above us here in southern England in the same time period. And of course they would confirm that people were present when the trials took place in north-eastern Scotland, and above all they confirmed that the consent was often assumed, not informed.
The government response was careful. We have acknowledgement that the standards were very different at the time, that the practices would not be acceptable today, and that transparency had been lacking. This wasn't framed as a crime, it was framed as history.
Right, we're heading back indoors, because what I want to show you now, well, I can show you from a computer, but I can't show you here in person in real life, which is very curious. But come and have a look at this.
So Portendown didn't just collapse under this new exposure, it just adapted. The science continued, but it didn't close. And perhaps because those secrets had been exposed decades on, well, maybe now we could never return to what it once was. But what do we find there today? It's still heavily guarded from every direction, as we've seen. And do we have any justification whatsoever for calling this the UK's Area 51? Have a look at some of these images from the computer. Today you can drive between Porton Village and you can drive down to Winterslow. It's possibly one of the most surreal drives you will do in this country. Now I'm going to pop a Google pin in here because this is on Google, active for anybody to see in the public domain, so you can see what I'm looking at. It's such a surreal landscape. This is like something out of a science fiction movie. Really, what we see around us today looks like any part of Salisbury Plain, but it feels different. Today, Porton Down operates under a different name and a very different framework, and whilst we're still focusing on chemical and biological defence, well, we're now focusing very much on emergency response and protection against modern threats. Porton Down was instrumental in dealing with the Salisbury Novichok attacks over a decade ago. The research conducted here today is governed by independent ethics committees, medical consent standards and legal accountability, and yet the fence is still here. The signs are still here, and whilst I can walk along its perimeter on this footpath, I've not been able to point the camera in its general direction even once. So what are we supposed to make of a place like this today? A place that clearly helped defend the country, but perhaps crossed a few ethical lines on the way. So maybe the real story isn't about this place at all. It's not about Porton Down. Maybe it's about us. What society is willing to accept when it believes the threat is existential. Because places like this don't just test chemical weapons, they seem to test values. Long after the fences are built, the questions still remain.